Michael Jackson, the king of pop, a global icon who, from the outside, seemed to have everything. But his sudden death in 2009 ripped the curtain back on a story that was so much darker and way more complicated than most of us ever knew. So today, let's get into the tragic final chapter of his life and really try to understand the forces that led to it. You want to understand the paradox of Michael Jackson's life? Just look at this. For years after his death, he was the #1 highest-earning dead celebrity, a titan of industry even from beyond the grave. His legacy was still a massive money-making machine. But while his estate was making a fortune, his body was, well, it was completely broken. This quote from his autopsy report is just horrifying. It paints this picture of a man who was literally running on nothing but chemicals. So how on earth did the king of pop get to such a tragic and, frankly, lonely end? Okay, let's go to that day, June 25th, 2009. The world just stopped. He was only weeks away from launching this huge comeback tour, and then the news broke. Michael Jackson was dead. He was only 50 years old. So the official cause of death was listed as acute propofol intoxication, an overdose. But you know what? That's just the headline. That's not the real story. The full story is a tragedy that was decades in the making, full of pain, unimaginable pressure, and a deep, deep addiction. To get it, we really need to look at the drug that killed him. The drug right at the center of his death was this incredibly powerful anesthetic. He'd become so dependent on it that he even had a nickname for it. He called it his milk. And his milk was propofol. Let's be really clear about what this stuff is. As you can see, this is a hospital-grade anesthetic. It's what they use to completely knock you out from major surgery. This is not, under any circumstances, a treatment for insomnia. But that's exactly what he was using it for. To fight a case of insomnia so severe that nothing else would even touch it. You know, the timeline of his final hours is just, it's chilling. In a desperate attempt to get him to sleep, his personal doctor gave him this cocktail of sedatives, Valium, then Ativan, then Versed. But nothing worked. Hours went by, and he was still wide awake. So finally, Jackson demanded the one thing he believed would work, a dose of propofol, and it would be a fatal one. And look, it wasn't just what was given, it was how. This drug, this powerful anesthetic, was administered in his bedroom, not an operating room. There was no heart monitor, no oxygen, no resuscitation equipment, none of the standard life-saving gear you're supposed to have. And that blatant negligence is exactly why his doctor was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. So it really begs the question, right? Why would a global superstar need a surgical anesthetic just to get some sleep? Well, to answer that, we have to go way back. We have to trace the origins of his pain and his trauma, because the insomnia, that wasn't the disease. It was a symptom of something much, much deeper. His entire life was basically a timeline of trauma. I mean, from the horrible abuse he suffered as a kid, to that awful accident during the Pepsi commercial in '84 that left him with severe burns, and then the lifelong battle with a skin disorder. This was a man who was living with deep psychological scars and constant physical pain. And that trauma, it really started in childhood. The physical beatings were reportedly constant. But the emotional abuse, his own father teasing him relentlessly about his nose, that created this deep, deep insecurity that fueled a lifetime of plastic surgery and left him with just profound body image issues. And this slide right here perfectly highlights that huge disconnect between his public image and his private struggle. For years, the story was that he was bleaching his skin, that he was rejecting his Black heritage. But the reality, confirmed by his own autopsy, was that he suffered from vitiligo, a medical condition that literally destroys the pigment in your skin. So on top of all this physical and psychological pain, then came the public allegations. These would define the entire second half of his life and just amplify all his feelings of paranoia and being persecuted. In 1993, right in the middle of the first child molestation investigation, this statement came out. And it wasn't from some random tabloid, it was from his own sister, LaToya. It was an absolutely staggering betrayal that just poured fuel on the media fire. But then she took it all back. She later retracted the whole thing, claiming her abusive husband had actually forced her to say it. And this just shows you the whirlwind of chaos and accusations and media manipulation that was constantly swirling around him. It was impossible for him to find any peace. Now, even though he was acquitted in his 2005 trial, the damage was done. His reputation was destroyed. The intense public scrutiny from those trials just shattered him mentally. It drove him deeper and deeper into isolation, and his reliance on prescription drugs to cope with the crushing stress and anxiety, and especially the sleeplessness, it just grew and grew. And all of this brings us to the final chapter. By the late 2000s, he was facing crippling financial problems, and that desperation pushed him toward a comeback tour that he was simply not physically or mentally prepared to handle. He had poured $17 million into his dream, the Neverland Ranch. But after the trials, it wasn't a refuge anymore. It became a symbol of his isolation and, honestly, a massive financial burden. By 2009, he was facing millions of dollars in debt. The pressure was just immense, and it forced him out of a retirement he desperately needed and back onto the stage. It was the only way he knew how to solve a financial crisis. And you know what? The world was more than ready for his return. Over 1 million tickets for his This Is It concert series sold out in just a few hours. The demand was absolutely insane. The King of Pop was all set for this triumphant, massive comeback. But the man the world wanted to see? He was really just a shadow of his former self. He was physically frail, mentally exhausted, and completely dependent on a surgical anesthetic just to get a few hours of sleep. The strain of preparing for 50 sold-out shows, it was the final unbearable weight that created the perfect storm for tragedy. So, in the end, his death wasn't just about one drug or one doctor. It was the tragic end to a lifetime of trauma, addiction, and unimaginable pressure. And it leaves us with this haunting question. Michael Jackson had everything we think of as success, but what is the true human cost of being the king?